So, as part of the service, we're going to adjust the valve clearances. One of the first things we've got, you'll notice the bonnet is up nice and high because we've got the special little bent bit of metal to hold the bonnet up. That makes life a lot easier when you're working in this area of the engine. So I've got to take off the air filter and then the rocker cover, and then we have the valves exposed, and we'll go through the sequence of adjusting the valves. The engine is cold, it hasn't been run, we left it overnight. Although the Citroen does specify you can do it hot, but when you do it hot you tend to burn your hands, so I like to do the engine when it's cold. So first of all I'm going to remove the air cleaner. So slacken this clamp on top of the carburetor and pull this breather pipe off the back. And you can do one of the clips from this side. I'm going to take this clamp off because quite often it will fall down into the engine and then you won't be able to find it. Undo the two other clips on the top of the air filter and lift it off complete with the air filter itself. So to remove the air cleaner housing, there's two nuts which are on studs into the top of the exhaust manifold. And usually, if this hasn't been off for a while, these will be rusted solid. And quite often you can shear the studs off. So what we've done here is, because we rebuilt the engine a little while ago, I've used stainless steel nuts, which, being a different metal from the ordinary mild steel studs, tend not to seize on. So that's always a good tip. You can use either stainless steel or brass or even copper nuts are also useful when you're using nuts that have to go onto an exhaust manifold. Now the bolt at the back is of course awkward and you can't see it, but I know it's there, and one technique is to use this arrangement whereby you can actually get your hands onto the nut. I'll remove the spanner, but you can't see it and your head can't be in the same place. So it's all typically Citroen awkward and I'm struggling slightly. But that is part of the game when working on Citroens. I'm pretty close. There we go. Lift it up off the studs and pull it out from the breather, and that's the air cleaner out of the way. So I'm now going to remove the spark plugs, leads, and the insulated tubes while we're at it. I find Mark 1 little finger works when pulling those out. And now the lead tidy, which is bolted onto the stud that holds the rocker cover on. Hopefully I should just be able to undo this by hand. And then just move the HT leads out of the way. Tuck over there. We've then got the oil cap securing tag, if you like, and it's attached and of course doesn't want to come off. Here we go. So Citroen, in their wisdom, I've got two different sizes of bolts. Nope, scrap that. Not on this car. So these are 12mm, and you've got the stud at the front, obviously, and just a bolt at the back. On early cars, i.e. pre-67 cars, such as this, the bolts are both 12mm AF, and on later cars, the front one's 12 and the rear one's 11. Okay, with those bolts off. And just make sure we've got enough clearance, and the whole rocker cover might just be wiggled and it'll lift up. And hopefully it will come with the seal, but it won't, not necessarily. You slightly have to work it over the back of the valves, and there you are, rocker cover off. So there are a couple of ways you can do it in sequence, and I'm going to show you the way that I prefer. We've got the clearances I'm using, Stone Cold engine, are 6 thou and 8 thou. That's 0.15 and 0.2 to you metric people. So I'm now going to set the valves in a particular sequence, and the sequence I use is number 1 exhaust valve fully open. When that one's fully open, you can then adjust number 3 inlet and number 4 exhaust, and then we'll run through it in sequence and do 2 valves at a time. So the first thing is I need to get the exhaust valve to be fully open. Now what that means is I'll turn the engine over on the crank handle, which is ready in the gearbox, and the spark plugs are out, and you'll see that when the rocker pivots on here and when the spring is compressed, that's when I know that one is fully open, and the other 3 will remain shut. So turning the engine over, that's number 4 open closing, and number 2 opening and closing. And now, oops, I've gone too far. Oh, so I'll have to go back. 4, 2, and here's number 1. There's number 1 fully open. Right, so this is number 1 exhaust valve fully open. The springs are compressed, all these springs aren't. So number 1 is fully open on the exhaust, which means I can adjust number 3 inlet and number 4 exhaust. You can see I can move the rockers slightly, which shows they have clearance. So because I know they're too tight, first of all you have to slacken off the lock nut, which is a 10mm, and then with your 6 thou or 0.15mm feeler gauge, I'm going to slacken off the adjustment slightly. Put the feeler gauge in between the rocker and the valve, and it's a little bit slack. So there's a little bit of a, it's difficult to see on camera, but it's because it's all about feel. I'm feeling the feeler gauge of how much resistance is, and I'm turning the screwdriver, but it's only such a tiny amount, you probably won't see it. And the other thing is that when you do the lock nut up, of course that will also change the clearance slightly, so you have to double check once you've done the lock nut. That's still slightly too slack for me. So once again, crack the lock nut off, turn the screw very slightly, and then lock the lock nut up. And that then is a nice clearance. Okay, so now we'll move on to the exhaust, number 4, which is this one at the back. Now I'm doing them all because I know they're tight. Now the one at the back here, number 4, is of course awkward because you've got a bulkhead in the way, so you'll need a stubby screwdriver to be able to get onto the adjuster. And it's a different size. It's 8 thou or 0.2mm. And once again, I'm moving the feeler gauge and adjusting the screw just to get it just a nice feel on it. Nip the lock nut up, slightly loose. Yep, that's about right. Okay. So we're now going to turn the engine over 180 degrees to move on to the next pair of valves. So the next one as the firing sequence is 1, 3, 4, 2, and we started with number 1. The next one that will be fully open will be number 3. So now I'll turn the engine over on the crank handle and watch for that valve opening. And here we are. And that is it approximately fully open. So now following the firing order sequence of 1, 3, 4, 2, we're now going to adjust number 4 inlet and number 2 exhaust. So I shall crack off the lock nut, get my 6 thou feeler gauge, And see if I can get the feeler gauge to fit. It's actually a little tight, as I was slightly expecting. This is a little bit of a fiddly operation. There we go. So I'm just feeling for the feeler gauge, trying to hold everything else, trying to get the spanner to lock up in place. I'll just double check that. In fact, now it's too slack. Typical. Ooh, I've hit the carburetor and everything. Okay. Yeah, that's a smidgen tight, but I'm going to live with it. So, 4-2. This is the next one, exhaust number 2. This will be easier to see. So first of all, I need the correct feeler gauge, 1/8 thou. And I can use my long screwdriver. And I can just feel that that's just nicely snug. Hold the screwdriver and tighten up the lock nut. And then double check on that. That's nice. Okay, so that's 2 down. Move on, turn the engine over again, and the next one will be number 4, which will be fully open. Okay, so turning the engine over and watching the exhaust. Number 4, there is number 4 fully open there. So with number 4 fully open, we can now do number 2 inlet and number 1 exhaust. So once again, 1/6 thou feeder. Just get the right feel for it. That's locked up slightly. That's good. And just nip up the lock nut. Final check, slightly too slack. There we go. Okay, now on to number 1, exhaust. There we go, that should be about right. Yep, that's a nice feel. Make sure that's nipped up. Double check. Yep, lovely. Okay, I'm moving on to the final one, which will be number 2. So I turn the engine over another 180 degrees and watch for the exhaust valve fully opening, and there it is. So again, using the firing order sequence, which is 1, 3, 4, 2, the next one to adjust is number 1 inlet and number 3 exhaust. So number 1 inlet, I'm just going to slide the feeler gauge in, and that's a little slack now. So crack off the lock nut, try not to lose the feeler gauge at the same time. You sort of need 3 hands when you're doing this job, but you can get away with 2. Right, so that's just about right. Well, it will be when I've locked up the lock nut. And a final check. No, it's a little slack. Do it again. Okay, right. Just a smidgen. Yep, that's nice. Okay, that's done. Right, number 3 exhaust. I'm going to slacken off the lock nut. Put the feeler gauge in, and this one's too slack. get a little bit more resistance than you want, so that when you tighten it up on the lock nut, it gets the clearance, it opens the clearance out slightly. That's still a touch too slack for my liking. So a smidgen tighter. Yep. And as I'm tightening this, I'm resisting turning this screw by holding the screwdriver backwards on itself to resist the turning of the lock nut. Otherwise, you can turn the adjuster and the lock nut at the same time, which means your clearance will change, which is why you need to double check it afterwards. But that's fine. Okay, valve clearances are done. We can now put it back together again. So we're now going to put I'm not going to put the rocker cover back on the engine, and a couple of points before we do that is to look at the gaskets. Now here is the main rocker cover gasket, and the thing to know about this is if you can hold it out and it stays in one place, or if you cannot twist it and it breaks, then you need to get a new one. This one is nice and new and flexible, so we're going to reuse that. Also, you've got 4 individual ones, and these go on the spark plug wells, and they are supported by a steel ring underneath them, which is just a washer. Again, these need to be nice and flexible, which this one is, and I shall now pop that into place. So the ring goes on first, and it comes to a ridge, it doesn't go too far down, and then the rubber goes on, and that's it now, ready to take the rocker cover. So here's a rocker cover, relatively clean, nice and clean. And I'm now going to put the gasket on. Now you'll see it's got it can only go one way because it's got a little bit of a shape to it, and it just pushes on. You don't need to glue it on with anything, but of course it's fiddly, like that, all the way around. And it is quite common that as you're trying to fit it, it might catch on something and then pull off, and you might have to do it again. Anyway, gasket on like that. So we now have to work the rocker cover onto the top of the head, trying to avoid all the bolts and what have you, and it pops down into place. On other cars, normally there's the heater pipe will come up in this area, and you'll have to move it out of the way in order to get the back of the rocker cover down. Once it's in place, it's always a good idea just to check that the rocker gasket hasn't actually come off all the way around, but you can actually feel if it's sitting on square. That's on. So this is the rear bolt. That's done up just by hand. And now the front bolt, which is the longer stud, in by hand. Right, tighten them up. These ones are 12mm. Now they need to be reasonably tight because they're compressing not only the 4 spark plug tube seals, but also the main gasket. And if you don't tighten them up enough, what can happen is oil can seep past these seals and come up and go into the spark plug wells, and then you could end up with a misfire because the spark plug well just fills up with oil. So just want to feel that you are actually compressing the rubber. That feels about right to me. There's probably a torque setting for it, but again, I'm doing it by feel. Then we have the oil filler securing strap, which pops on. And now I need to fit the spark plugs. So I'll drop them all in. I've already checked that they're all okay. And on this car we will need a special tool, which my helpful assistant will have put to one side. Because of these extra pipes, this is a Swedish car, and so it's got extra heating pipes, which just so happens foul the hole where you would normally put your spark plug spanner. So this is just a shortened version, or it's in fact the correct citron tool. which I'll just tighten up with a screwdriver. Again, we're not doing it terribly tight. There we go. Now the insulators. And the HT leads, which we'll fold back from where they were. And the spark plug tidy, which is there. Should I say the HT lead tidy? Okay, so pop them off the holders so that you can get them onto the top of the spark plug easier. And you should feel just a little resistance as it pops on. It's slightly greasy. There we go. And then put the cap on and clip the HT lead into place. Number 2. Of course, you can't see the top of the spark plug, so it's all done by feel. There we go. And number 3. And number 4. There we go. Finally, tighten up the nut securing the lead tidy, making sure they're all nicely clipped into place. Okay, now we're moving on to putting on the air cleaner.